Corin had always lived on the edge. As a scavenger, he had grown up learning how to survive in the harshest conditions: deep jungles, desert wastelands, and especially the freezing cold. But nothing could have prepared him for Phi. This icy planet, far in the outer reaches of the galaxy, was a place where the cold could kill you faster than anything else. The air on Phi was thin, and the wind howled constantly, a fierce cry that carried across the barren, snow-covered landscape. There were no cities here, no homes, just endless ice and mountains. Corin had landed on Phi for one reason: survival. The ship he had been traveling on had crashed after a sudden malfunction, leaving him stranded. With no other choice, he used his skills to survive, scavenging whatever he could find and keeping his head down. But on this day, Corin's life would change forever. It started with a strange signal, one that came through the crackling, broken comlink in his gear. The message was weak, barely audible, but Corin could hear it clearly enough. Help. Research station. Dragon eggs. Station down. That was all it said before the transmission cut off. At first, Corin thought it was a trap. Phi was not a planet where anyone could survive easily. There were rumors about dangerous creatures lurking in the depths of the mountains, and strange experiments happening far from the rest of civilization. But something about the signal stirred something inside him. He knew that if he didn't investigate, no one would. So Corin packed what little he had, a thermal suit, a few basic survival tools, and some food, and set off toward the source of the signal. The wind picked up as he climbed the jagged mountains, pushing against him with every step. But Corin was used to hardship. He kept moving, driven by a sense of duty he couldn't explain. By the time he reached the research station, the storm had grown violent. It was like nature itself was trying to stop him, but Corin pushed on, using every ounce of strength to fight through the snow and ice. When he finally reached the building, he found it abandoned. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and the doors frozen shut. Inside it was worse. The power was out, and everything was covered in a thick layer of ice. He could see the remains of the research team scattered across the station, frozen, lifeless, their bodies trapped in the ice. Corin's heart sank as he realized that the signal had been a desperate cry for help, but it was too late for them. Still, something caught his attention as he explored the station further. There, in a large chamber at the heart of the facility, was a collection of eggs. Not ordinary eggs, but massive ones, each the size of a small vehicle. Their shells were icy, faintly glowing with an eerie blue light, and from within the eggs, Corin could hear faint noises, soft, desperate cries. They were dragon eggs. Corin's mind raced. Dragons were supposed to be myths. Legends told of ancient creatures that could control the skies and breathe fire, but no one had seen one in centuries. If these eggs were real, if these dragons were real, then this station had been studying something far beyond ordinary science. But the storm outside was getting worse. Corin knew that if he didn't act quickly, the eggs would freeze and the hatchlings inside would die. His hands shook as he hurriedly examined the equipment in the station. The incubation chambers that had been keeping the eggs warm had broken down. The temperature was dropping fast, and the dragons inside were in danger of perishing before they even hatched. In that moment, Corin made a decision. He couldn't leave them to die. He worked quickly, using his scavenged tools to restore power to the station and stabilize the chambers. His fingers were numb from the cold, but he didn't stop. Every second counted. He could hear the cries growing louder, the desperate sound of life fighting to survive. The storm outside howled, shaking the walls, but Corin didn't give up. He rerouted the power, adjusted the settings on the incubators, and slowly, the temperature inside the room began to rise. He watched, his breath fogging in the air. As the eggs started to glow brighter, the light pulsing with life. Then, the first crack appeared. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft popping sound like the crack of ice under pressure. Corin stared wide-eyed as the eggs slowly began to split. A small reptilian face poked out from the broken shell, covered in scales that shimmered in the dim light. Corin's heart raced. The dragon was real. He had just witnessed the hatching of a creature that had been thought extinct for centuries. The hatchling looked up at Corin with wide, golden eyes. It was tiny, no bigger than a small dog, but there was something about its gaze, an intelligence, a sense of recognition. Corin felt a strange pull in his chest, an inexplicable connection to the creature. And then, before he could react, the hatchling moved. It stumbled forward, its tiny claws scratching the cold floor as it made its way toward him. Corin froze, unsure of what to do. But then the hatchling reached him, and to his surprise it nuzzled against his leg, almost as if it was thanking him for saving it. Corin bent down slowly, reaching out a hand. The hatchling didn't flinch. Instead, it rubbed its head against his palm, a soft purr-like sound escaping from its throat. Corin's mind spun. He had saved this creature's life, but the bond between them felt deeper than just a simple act of rescue. There was something powerful about the connection between him and the dragon. As he looked at the other eggs, he saw more hatchlings beginning to emerge, each one looking toward him with those same intelligent eyes. Corin realized that he had just become part of something much larger than himself, something ancient, something powerful. And he didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The storm outside raged on, but Corin wasn't afraid. With the hatchlings by his side, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The days on Scifi were long and cold, but Corin found himself growing used to the harsh environment. The research station had been a temporary shelter, but the more he stayed there, the more he realized it wasn't safe. The storms outside were unpredictable and dangerous, and now, with the hatchlings by his side, Corin had an even greater responsibility. He couldn't stay in the station forever. It was falling apart and the food supply was running low. He needed to find a way to survive, not just for himself, but for the dragons he had saved. The first few days after the hatchlings had emerged were a blur of work. He spent hours repairing what he could of the station, hoping to make it livable for a little longer. But the hatchlings, though small, were demanding. They needed warmth, food, and constant care. It was like having a dozen babies, each with their own unique needs. HFY, the largest of the hatchlings, stood out from the others. Even though she was small, no bigger than a house cat, there was a strange intelligence in her eyes. It wasn't just the way she looked at Corin. It was how she acted. She seemed to understand him, to anticipate his needs before he even spoke. She followed him everywhere, her movements graceful and silent as though she had been with him all her life. Corin didn't understand it. He had read about dragons before in stories and old books, but he never imagined they could bond with humans like this. Still, every time HFY looked at him with those bright golden eyes, Corin felt a strange warmth in his chest. The other hatchlings were growing fast, but HFY was different. Her scales shimmered with a faint blue light, and her breath seemed to have a strange effect on the temperature around her. Corin noticed that when she was near, the air seemed warmer, less harsh. She had a natural ability to provide heat, almost like a living furnace. It made the nights more bearable, and Corin grew to rely on her warmth during the long, cold hours. But survival on Scifi wasn't just about staying warm. Corin knew he needed food and supplies. He had a small supply of rations, but it wouldn't last long. And the hunt for food wasn't easy. The planet's wildlife was just as dangerous as its weather. There were creatures that roamed the icy plains, large, shadowy beasts that hunted in packs. Corin had seen signs of them during his travels, large claw marks on the ice, broken trees, and the remnants of animals that hadn't been fast enough to escape. Corin wasn't a fighter. He had learned to avoid trouble, not seek it out. But with the hatchlings to protect, he couldn't afford to be careless. He needed to be smart. One morning, Corin set out carrying only a small pack, a thermal blade for hunting, and a few basic supplies. He left the hatchlings behind, knowing they were still too young to travel far. HFY, however, was already showing signs of her growing strength. She looked at him as he prepared to leave, her eyes bright and intense. "Stay here," Corin said softly. But HFY didn't listen. She followed him, her steps light in the snow. Corin turned to face her, trying to keep his frustration in check. "HFY, you're not ready for this." The hatchling gave a small chirp, a sound that Corin was beginning to understand. She wasn't going to leave him. There was something about the way she looked at him, something that told him she would never let him go alone. With a sigh, Corin relented. "Fine, but you stay close." As they walked through the icy plains, Corin kept his eyes sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The wind had died down, but the snow still blanketed the ground, making it difficult to see far. It was easy to get lost in this kind of weather. But HFY's presence gave him a strange sense of confidence. She was with him, and he wasn't about to let anything happen to her. Hours passed without incident, and they came across a small herd of large horned creatures grazing in the distance. Corin knew these creatures weren't dangerous, but they were perfect prey. He had seen them before, and their meat would provide enough food to last them for days. The hunt wasn't difficult. Corin used the terrain to his advantage, creeping closer to the herd. His thermal blade was silent, but the creatures had sharp senses. He needed to move quickly. HFY, sensing Corin's intentions, crouched low to the ground. Her scales shimmered in the pale sunlight, and she blended into the snow, almost invisible. Corin couldn't help but admire her. She was far more skilled than he had anticipated. As they closed the distance, one of the creatures noticed them and began to charge. Corin reacted instinctively, running forward to intercept it. HFY surprisingly moved even faster. She darted ahead, her small body a blur as she leaped onto the creature's back, her claws sinking into its thick hide. The creature roared, throwing its head back in anger, but HFY held on, her claws digging in. She was stronger than Corin had imagined. "Hold on," Corin shouted, rushing to help. But before he could reach them, the creature collapsed, its massive body crashing to the ground. HFY stood triumphantly atop it, her chest rising and falling with each breath, her eyes flashing with excitement. Corin stood in awe. She had taken down the creature by herself. It was as if she had been born to hunt. He walked up to her, a smile spreading across his face. "Well done, HFY." The hatchling gave another chirp, looking up at him with pride. Corin couldn't believe how much she had grown in such a short time. She wasn't just a dragon. She was a partner, a protector, someone he could rely on in ways he hadn't expected. Together they gathered what they needed from the creature, and Corin carefully packaged the meat to carry back. It wasn't just about survival anymore. The bond between him and the hatchlings had changed something in Corin. He wasn't alone in this vast, cold world. As they made their way back to the station, Corin couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The dragons were more than just a rare species. They were something else entirely, and he was connected to them in a way that he couldn't yet explain. The journey ahead would be dangerous. But with HFY by his side, Corin was ready for whatever the frozen world of Firi could throw at him. The days on Firi were growing colder, and the storms seemed to grow fiercer with each passing week. Corin had become used to the harsh winds and freezing temperatures, but even his survival skills couldn't keep him from noticing that something was changing. The mountains were quieter, the wildlife more scarce, and a growing sense of unease gnawed at him. Something or someone was coming. Corin tried not to think about it too much. He focused on what he could control, keeping the hatchlings safe, hunting for food, and maintaining the station's fragile power systems. The eggs were long gone, and the hatchlings had now grown into small but strong creatures, each with their own unique traits. HFY, the largest of the group, had continued to grow rapidly, her scales now shimmering with a beautiful blue hue that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. She was still small compared to her full size, but the power in her eyes, the strength in her movements, made Corin believe she would be a force to reckon with one day. But despite the hatchlings' growth, there was a constant feeling that danger was looming. Corin had been out hunting one day when he first heard the rumblings. He was crouched low, preparing to take down a small herd of snow beasts when the ground beneath him vibrated. It was a subtle shake, but it was enough to make him freeze in place. His heart began to race, and he turned his attention to the mountains in the distance. The storm clouds were rolling in thick and fast, but there was something else moving in the distance, a dark shape against the white expanse. He didn't know what it was, but it wasn't a storm. It was something large, and it was coming toward him. Corin immediately gathered his things and hurried back to the research station, his instincts telling him something was terribly wrong. When he arrived, he found the hatchlings restless, pacing around the small room. HFY, as usual, was closest to him, her eyes watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She seemed to sense that something was wrong, her sharp gaze fixed on the horizon where the storm clouds were now swirling ominously. "Stay close," Corin muttered, as he rushed to secure the station's door. But just as he was about to lock it, he heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving outside, the crunch of boots in the snow. He froze. "Not good," Corin whispered under his breath. He grabbed his survival pack, slung it over his shoulder, and turned to the hatchlings. They looked back at him, waiting for his instructions, their eyes wide and intelligent. HFY let out a soft whine, sensing his anxiety. Before he could react, the door was blasted open, and Corin barely had time to duck as a figure stormed inside. The man was tall, armored in thick military-grade clothing. His face was hidden behind a helmet, but Corin could see the weapon in his hands, a large high-tech rifle. Its barrel pointed straight at Corin. "You're coming with us," the man said, his voice cold and authoritative. Corin's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea who this person was, but it was clear they were not here to talk. He glanced back at the hatchlings, his mind racing. They were still too young to fight, too small to defend themselves against the intruders. "What do you want?" Corin demanded, trying to stall for time, buying himself a moment to think. He kept his eyes on the man, but his mind was already calculating his next move. The armored figure didn't respond at first. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes scanning the room. That's when Corin realized there were more of them. Figures in black armor were creeping in from the storm, entering the station from every direction. They had him surrounded. "The dragons," the man finally spoke again, his tone sharp. "We're here to take them. All of them." Corin's stomach dropped. He knew instantly what this was about. These people were after the hatchlings. They had to be. The dragons weren't just rare creatures. They were powerful, and in the wrong hands they could be used as weapons. Corin had no idea who these people were, but he knew they wouldn't hesitate to use the dragons for their own gain. He couldn't let that happen. "I won't let you take them," Corin said, his voice filled with determination. The weight of the survival pack on his back seemed heavier now, but he had no choice but to fight. He had to protect the hatchlings. Without warning, Corin lunged toward the nearest table, grabbing a thermal blade. It wasn't much, but it would give him a fighting chance. The man with the rifle smirked. "You think you can stop us with that?" he said, raising his weapon. The sound of the rifle charging made Corin's heart race, but just as the man fired, HFY lunged forward, her small body moving faster than he could have imagined. She hissed loudly, her claws extending, and with a burst of strength she slammed into the man's side, knocking him to the ground. The other soldiers didn't waste any time. They aimed their weapons at HFY, but Corin was already in motion, diving into the fray. He swung the thermal blade, striking at one of the men who was trying to get a clear shot. The soldier cried out, stumbling back as Corin's strike made contact. HFY, now standing beside him, let out a sharp roar, her scales glowing brightly. It wasn't just the heat from her body that was dangerous. It was the power that seemed to radiate from her, like she was tapping into some ancient force. The soldiers hesitated, confused by her sudden display of strength, but that gave Corin the opening he needed. He fought with everything he had, his body moving on instinct. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the soldiers from advancing. They were trained, well-equipped, and there were too many of them. The last thing Corin saw before he was forced to retreat was HFY standing strong, her eyes locked on him, a promise of protection in them. The soldiers were closing in, but the dragon wasn't about to let them take him or the others. With a last desperate glance, Corin grabbed one of the hatchlings and ran. HFY followed him, her body moving with a speed Corin had never seen. They had to get out fast. There was no telling who these people were, but he knew one thing for certain. They were not leaving without a fight. Corin ran through the snow, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no time to think, only to move. The soldiers were closing in behind him, and the hatchlings, though frightened, trusted him to keep them safe. HFY, who had been his protector from the moment she hatched, stayed close, her small but powerful form moving like lightning through the thick snow. The storm had picked up again, a blinding flurry of ice and wind making it harder to see. Corin could barely make out the shapes of the soldiers as they tried to follow him through the snow. But he knew they wouldn't stop. They were too determined, and they wanted the dragons. They would never stop until they had them. "Move faster," Corin muttered to himself, urging his legs to keep pumping despite the burning ache in his muscles. He had to get to the mountains. There was a narrow passage he had scouted earlier. It was a dangerous place, but it might just be the only way out. HFY's glowing scales shone faintly in the darkness, providing a little light to guide his way. Corin could hear the crunch of snow behind him, the sound of soldiers moving closer, but HFY was keeping them at bay. With each step, Corin could feel the bond between him and the hatchlings growing stronger. HFY, who was no longer just a helpless baby, was becoming a force to be reckoned with, but she couldn't fight all of them alone. The wind howled louder as they reached the foot of the mountain pass. Corin spotted the narrow opening ahead, a small gap between two massive ice-covered boulders. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. The snowstorm would give them a moment's cover, and the jagged rocks would provide some protection. "We're almost there," Corin panted, turning to look at HFY. The dragon didn't answer in words, of course. But Corin saw the determination in her golden eyes, and he knew she understood. She was ready. But just as Corin took the first step toward the gap in the rocks, a sharp cry split the air. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. From behind him, the soldiers had regrouped. They had set up a blockade, and now they were closing in from every direction. Corin's mind raced. There was no way out, not through the pass. He had only one choice. "HFY!" Corin shouted. The dragon, who had been keeping watch behind them, whipped around. Her eyes locked onto the soldiers, and her scales began to glow brighter. The air seemed to shimmer around her, and Corin could feel the heat rising. It was as if she had tapped into something deep within herself, something ancient, something powerful. The soldiers froze as they saw the change in HFY. Corin didn't know what was happening, but the dragon was growing stronger by the second. The energy around her was almost tangible, vibrating in the air. And then, without warning, HFY unleashed a roar so loud, so deafening, that the ground itself seemed to shake. The soldiers staggered back, their hands pressed to their ears, disoriented by the force of the sound. But it wasn't just the roar that had them reeling. It was the power that followed it. HFY's body pulsed with light, and with a single beat of her wings, the snow around them erupted into the air. A blinding flash of heat followed the sound, and Corin could only shield his eyes as the temperature around them shot up. The snow beneath their feet melted instantly, steam rising into the frigid air. The soldiers, struggling to stay on their feet, began backing away, their faces pale with fear. They had never seen anything like this before. Corin stared in awe at HFY. She was more than just a hatchling now. She was a dragon, and with her powers awakened, she was capable of more than he could ever have imagined. But as the soldiers retreated, Corin knew they wouldn't stay away for long. They would regroup, come back stronger, and find a way to capture them. They had the technology, the manpower, and the resources to keep chasing them. "We need to move," Corin said urgently, his voice shaking. He turned to HFY, who was still glowing. Her eyes filled with an energy Corin had never seen before. She wasn't just a dragon now. She was something ancient, a being whose power could shake the foundations of the world. HFY gave a low, rumbling growl and took off toward the mountains. Corin followed her, not daring to look back. The hatchlings, too, moved quickly, their small legs carrying them as fast as they could go. Corin was amazed at how quickly they had all adapted to the harsh conditions. They were no longer the fragile creatures he had first saved. They were survivors, and they had a bond stronger than anything Corin had ever known. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner, the wind colder. The storm raged around them, but Corin felt a sense of calm in HFY's presence. The dragon, though still small, was powerful, and Corin could feel the strength of their bond, a connection that seemed to go beyond anything he could explain. It was as if they were meant to be together, as if fate had brought them here for a reason. They reached a narrow ridge where the wind howled even louder, and Corin paused for a moment to catch his breath. The hatchlings huddled close, seeking warmth from HFY, who had now curled her body around them protectively. "We'll make it," Corin whispered to them, his voice filled with determination. "We have to." But as the words left his mouth, a new sound reached his ears. It wasn't the howling wind or the roar of the storm, it was the sound of engines. The soldiers weren't far behind. Corin turned to HFY, who was watching him with knowing eyes. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. He had no idea what the soldiers would do next, but with HFY by his side, he knew they had a chance. She had awakened. She was more than just a dragon now. She was their only hope, and together they would face whatever came next. As the roar of the engines grew louder, Corin took a deep breath and turned to the mountains ahead. The battle was far from over, but with HFY they were ready for anything. The snowstorm raged around Corin and HFY, the howling wind biting at their skin as they climbed higher into the mountain pass. The soldiers were still pursuing them. Their engines echoed in the distance, getting louder by the second. Corin didn't know how much longer they could keep running, but with HFY by his side, he couldn't give up. He had come too far and he had too much to protect. As they reached a small ledge high above the mountain, Corin glanced back at the hatchlings. They were huddled together, trying to keep warm. HFY, her scales glowing softly in the dark, stood in front of them, her body tense but ready. The bond between them had deepened over the past few weeks, and Corin could feel it now more than ever. HFY wasn't just his protector, she was his partner, and together they had a chance to survive. "Stay close," Corin whispered. He was exhausted, but he couldn't afford to stop. The soldiers were closing in, and they had no idea what HFY was truly capable of. He needed to keep moving, but just as they began to move forward, a loud crack echoed through the mountains, followed by a deep rumble. Corin froze. The ground beneath them shook, and the snow around them shifted violently. He grabbed HFY's side to steady himself, his heart racing in his chest. What was that? He muttered, looking around in confusion. He had never felt anything like it before. HFY let out a low growl, her eyes narrowing. She was alert, her body tense. Corin could feel her unease. And then, as if in answer to his question, the mountain split open with a deafening roar. The ground cracked wide, revealing a deep chasm below. Corin's eyes widened in shock. The mountain was unstable, and it was about to collapse. "HFY, we need to move," Corin shouted. But before he could react, a massive rock slide cascaded down the mountain, blocking their path. The soldiers, who had been closing in on them from behind, were now trapped on the other side of the avalanche. The massive boulders blocked the way forward and cut off the soldiers' pursuit. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the wind whistling through the narrow pass. Corin stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. But HFY didn't wait. She stepped forward, her wings unfurling as she roared into the storm. The sound was powerful, a battle cry that echoed through the mountains. Corin's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen her like this before. There was a fire in her eyes, a fierce, burning determination that made Corin feel something deep within himself. She wasn't just trying to escape anymore. She was ready to fight. "We're not running anymore," Corin muttered, feeling a surge of energy he hadn't felt before. The soldiers might be strong, but they didn't know what they were up against. With a sharp motion, HFY crouched down, her wings flaring to life. Corin climbed onto her back, the cold wind biting at his skin. He had never been on a dragon before, and though he had always dreamed of flying, this felt different. It wasn't just about the thrill of flight. It was about the bond they shared, about the fight for survival that had brought them together. As they took to the skies, the soldiers below looked up in shock. They had never seen anything like it. HFY soared above them, her wings beating strong and steady, carrying them higher into the storm. Corin could hear the soldiers shouting below, but he didn't care. They were safe, at least for now. The world below was a blur of white snow and dark mountain peaks, the storm swirling around them in a chaotic dance. But Corin had never felt more alive. This was where he was meant to be, flying with HFY together in this strange, beautiful world. HFY flew higher, her wings cutting through the storm, until they reached a narrow ridge that overlooked a vast icy plain. From up here, Corin could see the vastness of HFY. The land stretched on for miles, covered in snow and ice, a place that seemed uninhabitable to most. But Corin knew that this was their home now. "We made it," Corin said softly, his voice filled with awe. HFY circled above the ridge, her wings gliding effortlessly through the air. She let out a soft, pleased chirp as if acknowledging Corin's words. But Corin wasn't just celebrating their escape. He was thinking ahead, thinking of what came next. The soldiers wouldn't give up. They would keep coming for them, and sooner or later, they would figure out how to capture HFY and the other hatchlings. The fight wasn't over, but for now they had a moment of peace. "We need to find a place where they can't follow," Corin said, more to himself than to HFY. The dragon gave a soft growl, as if agreeing with him. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. They needed to find a hidden sanctuary, somewhere the soldiers would never think to look. Corin thought of the old stories he had heard as a child, tales of ancient dragon sanctuaries hidden deep within the mountains, far away from the reach of humans. He didn't know if those places still existed, but he was determined to find one. The dragons deserved to be free, and with HFY and the hatchlings at his side, Corin would make sure they stayed that way. As they flew on, Corin looked down at the hatchlings, who were now playing on the ridges below, their tiny wings fluttering in the wind. They were growing fast, stronger with each passing day, and with HFY leading the way, they were not just surviving, they were thriving. The soldiers may have been relentless, but they were no match for the dragons. And now that Corin had bonded with them, he knew that together they could face anything that came their way. Scifi might have been a cold and unforgiving world, but it was their world now. And with HFY at his side, Corin was ready to fight for their future.